Welcome. I'd like to talk a little bit today about the Logic Final project. I like to call it my Logic Scavenger Hunt. One of the things to keep in mind as you do this is don't wait until the last minute to do it. It will kill you to have to do all this at the last minute. As a matter of fact, one of the best ways to do it is sort of as we finish a module, if you get a little bit of time, look and see if there's anything that relates to that module that maybe you can go out and try to find. But the key idea here is that you are going to be looking for examples of arguments and different types in the media, such as newspapers, online, other places. People sometimes ask me, where's the best place to look? And the answer is sort of, one of the best places is probably the opinion page of a newspaper. If you pick up the State Journal Register or a local newspaper and read the letters to the editor, that is a good place to find examples of fallacies, to find what am I trying to say? To find examples of fallacies, arguments. You know, people are attempting to argue for things, and so those would be good places to find these things. The other place that some students from last semester told me that they found a lot of success was by looking at cartoons in the newspaper or online. That, you know, a lot of times, you know, they can find this cause and effect reasoning. They can find these deductive arguments. They can find these fallacies, all in those types of places. So the idea here is to find examples of what we are going to be doing in this course. Now, with that said, if you need to read through the instructions, but the basic idea here is that you're going to find, for example, one of the first things that we have is the category deduction. And deduction is basically a case of an argument form, and deduction is an argument form that says that basically says that if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily must be true. And there are different types. There's mathematical reasoning, there's arguments from definition, arguments from scientific law, and your goal is to go out and find examples of these. You'll do that with induction, you'll do that with informal fallacy, and then you'll have a few examples of formal fallacies and rules of inference, which will actually probably be maybe perhaps a little bit more difficult than the other categories. But if you'll notice on your sheet, it will say on there that there's a minimum number. So if it says deduction, it says minimum 5, maximum 12. That means you need to find at least 5 examples of deduction. Now, I would like for every one of those ones to be unique, meaning, you know, you don't use all 5 arguments from definition. But you can have up to 12, and if you have 12, then you can have arguments from definition, 2 or 3 examples of each. I probably say that, you know, if you have, I may have said a limit of 2, I would say 3 would probably be where I would probably set it at. Same thing with induction, all these. But you must meet the minimum, and the minimum must be unique. And then the maximum, you can repeat types. Now, you'll notice that if you do the minimums in each category, you will only end up with 24 fallacies, 24 examples, or not fallacies, 24 examples of things. So you will need to go back and you will need to find you know, multiples of some of these. You'll need to find, you know, reach above that number to get to the minimum. But I don't want you finding everything from the category of induction or deduction or fallacies, and so I put limits on it. And so that's sort of the reason there's minimums and maximums. Now, the other thing I would like to mention is that, you know, read through the organization. I do keep very careful track. I am very particular about the fact that, you know, you need a table of contents that's accurate. I like things to be numbered. I like things to be neat and clean. I like things to be typed. You know, if you're going to submit this online, now you do have the option to bring it in, and I would have you put it in my Dropbox on campus. Otherwise, you can also submit it in person. If you're going to submit it on campus, that's fine. As a matter of fact, when I've taught online in the past, this class, and I've given this project, I would say 2/3 of the people like to actually bring in a paper copy. Why? Because there's a lot of organizational work. And so when you read that organizational section, one thing to keep in mind is that, you know, there is a lot to that about typing, about organizing, about keeping everything neat. You can handwrite it. I do say to type it. I do accept handwriting, but the key is it has to be extremely neat. If I can't read your writing, it's going to be a 0, just straight up. If you do it neatly and you do very nice clear lettering, you know, I don't mind if it's handwritten. But and sometimes I find people who handwrite actually, they look better than who is typed. But by and large, I prefer it to be typed. So if you decide that you would like to do it by hand, that way you can number it and organize it a little bit differently, that is fine. Just email me or I will provide a little bit of detail about dropping it off. That way I don't get 10 of them dropped off and then, you know, they're just sort of piling up in some place where they get lost. So that's basically the way the project works. What my suggestion is as you go along, you know, as we do induction, you begin to look for examples of that. As we do deduction, you begin to look for examples. As you do other things, you begin to look for examples. And that as we do it, you go along. So you'll find in this file, in this folder, in this module, you'll find which will be open all the way to Thursday, May 15th, and at 8 p.m. And at that point, it will close, and if you have not submitted it, then you're not going to be able to submit it because I will need time to grade these. But the case is if you turn it in, up until that time, this module will be open, and in it there will be this video, there will be the instructions, which you should read through. There will also be the Dropbox, or the place where you submit the homework. And finally, there will be a sheet that gives a little bit more detail. And basically all it does is it gives a definition of each of the different types of induction and deduction. Not so much because you wouldn't find that in the lesson, but just so you have one quick guide to it. One of my past classes asked for that. I put it together, and so that's there. You might want to just print it off and keep that handy. That might be something handy for the entire semester because it might actually have some examples and help you out throughout things. Now, don't try to get too far ahead on this project because to a certain degree, you know, this is supposed to be reinforcing ideas. As I said, as we cover the material, as we get to induction and deduction, I would suggest you work on this project, but I wouldn't suggest you try to finish the project too early. I think you should wait until we actually cover the material. If you would like to submit examples early for me to look at, that would be fine. Email me. And, last but not least, one of the things that I don't know will happen, I think it will happen more if you wait till last minute to do this, but sometimes what I'll find is people will actually Google words like red herring, and then they'll find an example of a red herring from a site like Wikipedia/red herring. That is not acceptable. Googling red herring is not what I'm looking for. I can do that. I know you can do that. I'm not doubting your ability to do a Google search on each of these things and find an example from a logic textbook or a Wikipedia page or some other philosopher's page. That is not something I feel like we would need to master. Instead, one of the things that I do like is for you to find these examples in the real world. They can come from, watching a video, a TV show, reading the newspaper, reading books, reading fiction, all types of things. But the idea is that you are observing these things and going, hey, that's a good example of a type of argument, or that's a good example of fallacy, or that's a good example of this. And so that's what I'm looking for. If you want to Google red herring to get some examples, just so you can maybe help yourself get your creative juices going on when you've seen a red herring or a slippery slope in the past, that's fine. But to actually just look for those keywords through a Google search is not acceptable, and I will not give credit for that. And usually the way I'll tell is, if you use those, oftentimes I'll find as I'm going through, I'll go, oh, 4 people have the exact same example of red herring. And so I'll type in red herring, and it ends up that's one of the first hits that comes up in Google. So what I would suggest is don't try to take the lazy way out, because it will end up resulting in you failing that, not getting any credit for it. And if you've done it a lot, if you've done more than, say, a few, that way, it's just clearly that's how you try to finish your project. I would probably just give you a 0. So, that would be 200 points on your grade as a 0. It would be a pretty big hit. So I do not do that. Now, finally, there was one last thing I wanted to mention. Make sure to cite things. Oh, and then the last thing is sometimes people will see these things in, for example, you'll go online and, or I'm sorry, you'll be watching TV one evening and you'll see an example of something that we did in Logic class that you're like, oh, that's a really good example of this, or that's a really good example of something else. That's fine, that's perfect. I would prefer that not all your examples come from TV. I like to be able to have an actual picture of it. But if you find something in a movie or other things, what I always tell people is just write up a small narrative of what you saw and then explain how that meets the requirement. And so instead of actually having to cut out an example, an artifact of the example you're giving, what I am actually going to say is, you can write up that if it's a TV show, but make sure to cite it and make sure to tell you, where you got it from, and make sure to give a little bit of detail. Don't just tell me, don't just go to the explanation. Okay? If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I may try to give a little bit more and update this, but I at least wanted to give an introductory video on this before we get started. So if you have questions, email me, and hopefully we will, this project will go well. Thank you.